Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the fourth day of Getting Real. I just want to mention that a couple of the recordings from the first day's keynote and panels are now on IDA's YouTube channel. My name is Nat Ruiz Tefano, and I had the privilege of being a programmer for this year's Getting Real. I join you from Oakland, California, on unceded land of the Ohlone and Chochenyo people. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a mixed race, brown-skinned, non-binary person with short, wavy brown hair. I'm wearing brown glasses and a gray short-sleeved collared shirt, and I'm sitting in my dining room, and behind me is a white brick wall and marigold flowers and framed art. I'm thrilled to introduce today's keynote by Sam Feder, Director of Disclosure, followed by a conversation between Sam and Laverne Cox, Executive Producer of Disclosure. Sam's award-winning films explore legacy, conflict, and futures within the queer and trans communities, while working towards higher ethical standards in filmmaking. Sam's first film, Boy I Am, explored important but rarely publicly discussed issues around the resistance of some women in feminist and lesbian communities against trans people who transition from female to male. Sam's second film, Kate Bornstein is a Queer in Pleasant Danger, is about the visionary trans author and performer, Kate Bornstein. And this year's film, Disclosure, is an unprecedented, eye-opening look at transgender depictions in film and television, revealing how Hollywood simultaneously reflects and manufactures our deepest anxieties about gender. Laverne Cox is a 3-time Emmy-nominated actress, an Emmy-winning director, documentary film producer, and a prominent equal rights advocate and public speaker. Her groundbreaking role in the critically acclaimed Netflix series Orange is the New Black brought her to the attention of diverse audiences around the world. This role led to Laverne becoming the first openly trans actress to be nominated for a Primetime Acting Emmy. Laverne also holds 2 SAG Awards, an artist and advocate of moving beyond gender expectations to live more authentically. Laverne is the first openly trans person to appear on the covers of Time, Cosmopolitan, Vogue, and Essence magazines. She is the executive producer of Free CC and the Emmy-winning documentary Laverne Cox Presents the T-Word. I'm particularly excited for today's conversation because of how much this film meant to me and so many people in my communities. As a non-binary identified person, watching Disclosure was like therapy for me. At first, it was jarring and destabilizing to revisit the portrayals of trans and non-binary characters in mainstream media that had created so much shame and fear in my younger self. But then to have brilliant trans people share their own experiences with those images and critically analyze and contextualize them within a larger transphobic culture was a freeing and healing experience that helped me feel more power in who I am now. In an interview on the Queer Review about the making of Disclosure, Sam states, "Trans people are the experts on their own history, and we really don't need anyone talking about us or for us in terms of our history." I felt that so deeply in my bones while watching Disclosure. And if the film had been made by non-trans people and with non-trans interviewees, I am certain that my experience in watching Disclosure would have been re-traumatizing rather than healing. Thank you so much, Sam and Laverne, for your vision and commitment to centering trans stories and trans storytellers. Before I pass it on to Sam, I want to let you all know that we will have a Q&A in the second portion during Sam and Laverne's conversation. So please paste your questions in the chat. And without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome Sam Feder, Director of Disclosure.
Hi, Sam. You're muted. Let's run it back. Thank you.
So all that time I was muted. Okay, I'm going to start over. That's good because I kind of messed up anyway. But I started by saying thank you to Nat. That was such a beautiful introduction and very meaningful to hear those words. I'm going to open up my talk. Okay, I am so excited to be here with you all today. I'm currently staying on Lenni Lappi land. I'm sorry, is there something wrong with our, I'm going to start over because there's something wrong with our system. Let's try this one more time. Okay, 3 times a charm, right? Okay, I am so excited to be here with you today. I'm currently staying on Lenni Lappi land, and I'm sitting in front of a brown couch, a light blue rug, and a few windows. I'm a white, queer, trans person with short brownish hair, and I'm wearing a, well, I guess it's sort of grayish, and I'm wearing a black shirt. And thank you to the IDA for bringing us together this week. Maggie, Nat, Simon, Jane, Leanne, Hannah, Cassidy, and the Crux team, Lauren, JR, JM, Jose, and countless other people behind the scenes. You've done an incredible job, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I really feel very honored to be here. You know, I had a draft of this talk where I thanked about 30 other people, but my producer said that wasn't a good use of time, which is their job, so I listened. But acknowledgement is really important, and in particular, it relates to this year's themes about who gives us access, how we attain power, and what possibilities come from that. And that all stems from the vital work that is often unseen and unacknowledged. And I want to talk about 3 of those often unseen practices in documentary filmmaking: compensating protagonists, empowering our crews, and who's in leadership. So for some background, this summer I released a film called Disclosure. And for those of you who haven't seen it, Disclosure is about trans representation in film and television, how that representation informs what non-trans people think about us and how we think about ourselves. In production, we prioritized hiring trans people. And when we couldn't do that, we mentored a trans person. Over 120 trans people contributed to Disclosure. And I've been reminded to let you all know that it is streaming on Netflix. Anyway, I started to think about Disclosure shortly after Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine, and that was June 2014, and she was the first openly trans woman to be on the cover. And she wore a beautiful blue dress and looked defiantly down at the camera, and the text on the cover read, "The Transgender Tipping Point." And the public conversation at the time suggested that visibility was a singular goal for trans people. And with Laverne on the cover, we had reached our goal. Yet the trans people that I knew were still struggling to access employment, access housing, safe housing, and healthcare. And one of the main threads in Disclosure is about how visibility both opens doors of possibility and can also be really dangerous. Because we know whenever a marginalized community gets mainstream attention, backlash ensues. And in the past few years, we've witnessed the violence towards trans people, especially the murders of Black trans women, reaching epidemic proportions. So the question of Disclosure is, how do we reconcile these 2 truths, right? The celebratory increase of visibility and the rise of social and legislative violence. Now, there's not a singular cause and effect relationship between visibility and violence. I would never argue that, but we do have to consider the fact that 80% of Americans say the only trans people they know are the ones they see in film and TV. And these images over the past century have been deeply distorted. You know, Yancey Ford, the Oscar-nominated director of Strong Island, which I'm sure most of you know, towards the end of Disclosure, he says, "We cannot be a better society until we see a better society. I cannot be in the world until I see I am in the world." And one of the sweetest moments in making the film was to be able to share with our crew last winter that Disclosure was going to premiere at Sundance. And I think in January of 2020, Park City experienced the biggest trans takeover ever. About 30 of us from the team were there. All right, so now Disclosure's in the world. Both reviews and audience feedback have exceeded our highest expectations. And now I'm zooming into a lot of Q&As, because that's what we do now, right? And last week, a grad student asked me about my creative process. He shared that as an Asian man who's not trans, he felt hurt that there wasn't much about trans Asian representation, and he wanted to know why. And of course, my first instinct was to defend the film, right? Justify our choices, point out the times that we did. I wanted to explain the process. I wanted to tell him how limited our resources were, that one film can't do everything, or what might be the most problematic answer of all of them is saying to him that I just couldn't find it. And while that might all be true, I actually don't think that's what his question was about. I think because he had access to me and not the countless directors who have used his body, his identity as a joke. His power in that moment was to ask his question. And I believe my responsibility in that moment was to interrogate my instinctual answer and to see what my answer was hiding. And I wanted to find an answer that would validate him rather than defending myself, an answer that would move the conversation forward so that I could do better next time rather than sounding right this time. I really identified with that student because, as you may know if you saw Disclosure, I tend to point out where a film has fallen short. And I think that moment, and in that moment between student and director, I was reminded of a film that I saw about, I think, 13 years ago. And that film was surrounded by some controversy for being transphobic. And at the Q&A, I asked the director about her responsibility, right? Since she knew her film had hurt a critical mass of trans people, I wanted to know what her responsibility was as a filmmaker. And I expected something like that she would say that her responsibility is to give a voice to another side, right? Spark a dialogue. But she said, the artist is only responsible to herself. And the people in the room applauded. And I was gutted. I felt dismissed. I felt scared. And I was hurt that she shut the door and didn't want to move the conversation forward, right? She didn't want to confront the pain that she caused. And I just hope that I didn't leave that student last week feeling that way. I hope my answer, which certainly could have been better, left an opening for him, a place for him to step into, to have access, power, and see the possibilities. We're gonna make mistakes, right? We're gonna make choices that hurt people. And I'm sure I've already done that in this talk already. But we get to choose how we deal with those mistakes. In making Disclosure, I was able to put into practice ideas and dreams that I've been cultivating and work on the mistakes that I've been wrestling with for the past 15 years. And I know the way that we made Disclosure, our production model, having trans people on all sides of the camera, our commitment to paying everyone and hiring and training trans people is what makes it unique, right? That ethos is in every frame. And I think people feel it and I think they see it. It was not easy, but making a film is not easy. We get to choose where we put our energy, our action, and our intention. Disclosure is proof of what can happen when the intention of the content is reflected in the process. I'm sure many of you were at Getting Real 2 years ago, and you probably remember the inspiring talk that Chi-Wei Yang gave, right? And he led with a disclaimer that it might sound too academic, but that's actually what really made me perk up, because I love thinking about our process as filmmakers within a particular frameworks. And one of the things I took away from his talk was his idea about documentary power, which he explained as the power relations behind the scenes, right? How we make our films and how power shapes the content of our stories. And if we could hold documentary power accountable, we could build more equitable social, cultural, and political power on a much broader level, because equitable documentary power is essential to social change. And so after that talk, I kept thinking about how in making Disclosure, we could put equitable documentary power into action and how that action could radically transform our reality. Now, my friend, author and performer Kate Bornstein taught me something that I believe she heard the Dalai Lama say, which was, the way we do anything is the way we do everything. Right? So how does that apply to our relationships with our protagonists? Now, films are so expensive to make, right? We fight tooth and nail for every grant. We've talked a lot about that this week. Some of us are laughed out of rooms because our budgets seem too high for our niche films. And that actually happened to us, right? And that was when our budget was half of what it ended up being. I mean, we walked into the room with a $600,000 budget. We were laughed out of that room. We ended up with a $1.2 million budget, so much money. And we ended up selling it for $600,000. And I share those numbers because we need transparency to hold all of us accountable. The makers, the funders, the buyers, the audience, we need a lot more transparency in this industry. I wonder, though, reflecting on that meeting in the room where we got laughed out and we felt pretty demoralized, will we replicate how the industry treats us when we make our films? If we're even lucky enough to access funding, what will we do with it? And I think that choice is less about getting the film made and more about our values and our intentions. In every step of making Disclosure, the values and intentions we held onto was the radical transformation we want to see for trans people, both on and off the screen. We committed to paying everyone, including compensating protagonists, for their time and their expertise. Now, it took years for some of our backers to understand the necessity of this. And even more so, we were told that funders can't fund a documentary that pays the subject. And a term in and of itself I struggle with. So instead of saying subject, I'll say protagonist or cast. Now, when I've asked both directors and funders, I've been told that paying the protagonist can threaten the integrity of the film. And I think the question hidden in that answer is, whose lives do we value? When we decide the distribution of our funds, whose access, power, and possibility is protected or denied? I felt 100% confident that anything our cast was going to say would not be compromised by compensating them for their time and expertise. There are so many factors that influence what our protagonists say and do in front of the camera. Trans people and all marginalized people are so often explained by and talked about by experts. Who is more of an expert of a life than the one who's living it? Trans people and all marginalized people are constantly asked to volunteer their time to educate the rest of us. But we, as directors, we might not make money off our films, but we gain cultural capital. We explain this in detail in our fundraising efforts, and eventually we found the right partners to make Disclosure. And we raised the money to offer honorariums to our cast. It was hard work, but here we are. Compensating our protagonists did not make or break anyone's life conditions, but possibilities are most often within reach to those with access and power. Now, in making Disclosure, we tried to walk the talk from top to bottom, and we were committed to empowering the people on our set. We paid our cast, we paid our crew, we prioritized hiring trans people to tell a trans story. And we learned that this process could be transformative within and outside of the film. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we couldn't hire a trans person for a key role, the non-trans person hired would mentor a trans fellow. Now, the fellow would learn new skills, network, experience a set where their lives were valued and centered. Many of the fellows have started to screen their own films across the country. But this exchange was not unidirectional from mentor to mentee. Right? During breaks, I'd ask mentees if they had questions they wanted me to include in the interviews. And some of the best stories came from those questions. And there was this unnameable sense of being when the lights went out and the AC would go off and it would get really hot, but the set would get really quiet, right? We'd all be a little nervous and excited. And I would introduce the interviewee to the people behind the camera who were all trans. And their faces would relax a little bit as they took that in. And I especially remember this when Lily Wachowski came for her interview, because she rarely does interviews, and she was shy and nervous to share her stories. When she realized she was with people who could identify with her in a deep way, it genuinely gave her pause, and she suddenly seemed so much more at ease and almost giddy. Right. And, after my interview with Rain Valdez, she said she had never had that experience before, where everywhere she looked, she saw another trans person. Like, for once, she wasn't the only one. One last story about our set. One of our stars is Sandra Caldwell, and she is a 69-year-old Black trans woman who's worked in the industry for over 40 years, mostly not being out as trans. And our assistant fellow sat in awe during Sandra's interview, learning that one of her childhood heroes from the TV show Cheetah Girls was in fact a Black trans woman just like her. Okay, actually, there's one more story I want to tell. Our lighting technician, Desi Cole, a white non-trans queer woman who identifies as a trans ally, but the environment and content were new to her, right? And she was so moved by her experience on set that it occurred to her that her union, IATSE, which is the largest tech union in the world, might not be the most welcoming place for a trans person. So she took action and worked with her chapter to create a trans sensitivity training for their members to better streamline membership for trans people. And as far as I know, that has been adopted by various other chapters in the country. We're also witnessing transformation for people watching the film, right? For trans and non-trans people alike, seeing trans people tell this story, hold it, and ground it in a context, contend with the violence and shame and hate we've all internalized about trans people. Seeing it outside of yourself can allow you to move past it in a way you haven't been able to before. The images that trans people have often seen in isolation, whether literally alone or with people they didn't feel understood them, were now being shared in community. Their experiences were being mirrored and validated. Now, even though Disclosure did not mirror and validate the experiences of the student I spoke to last week, I hope my answers have started to. And getting there can only be done within a process in which access and power are challenged, opening the door for transformative possibilities. When that door is opened, molecules begin to shift and we start to really see ourselves in the world differently. And until we live in a world of equitable access and power, I think a framework of equitable documentary power includes compensation across the room, empowering people on set, and also who's in leadership. 4 years ago at Getting Real, Grace Lee, filmmaker and friend of mine, said the following regarding people of color. She said, "The mandate for diverse content means there's a lot more demand for stories about communities of color. But the practice of pairing a white veteran producer with an associate producer, editor, or other person of color to diversify your team is not the same as supporting diverse perspectives or leadership." Now, I don't want to be in a world where we're only relegated to tell our stories, but we must continue to center those whose voices have been historically silenced. And that is done through access and power. There's a particular lens and sensitivity that a storyteller can hold only if they have a deeply personal stake in that story. And it's through that lens and those stories that we will start to see social change. Now, I know this is hard work, and I often wonder where we can find the time and the energy and the resources it demands upon us, filmmakers, to change the rules. Right? How do we justify the extra time it might take to raise our budgets, the days we don't take off, the self-care we push aside? I mean, we all need to and want to be acknowledged. We want to do our best to succeed. If that success is relegated to ours alone, I don't think our work will ever be living up to its potential. Getting Real has taught me so much over the years, and these conversations I've had here have allowed me to think more deeply about my responsibility as a filmmaker. I want to continue having conversations about how cultural equity can manifest in our filmmaking practice rather than reinforce inequity. I want to continue to develop the ways in which we make our films so they reflect the justice in the making that we want our films to convey. Even if your access and power is slight, just imagine how much it can grow if you share it. Before I close out and turn to my conversation with my executive producer, Laverne Cox, I do want to thank some people who have done so much of the unseen work, which is allowing me to have a voice. So thank you to our Netflix team, Renee, Audrey, Matt, Liv, John M, and John O. The Acme team, Nancy, Emily, and Sam. The Disclosure Impact team, Laverne, Amy, Liza, Mona, Bryce, Alex, Tuck, Anya, Jesse, Caroline, Laura, Matt, Sherman, Jenny, and Kat. And of course, all the Disclosure cast and crew, which is over 100 people. So I think I would really upset Amy, my producer, if I tried to thank everyone now. But there's one newer team that has been providing me great support, and those are my agents at Gersh, Amanda, Frank, and Rachel, and my manager at Luber Rockland, Randy Kean. And to all of you, thank you for your kind attention. Hi, Laverne.
Sam. Am I muted? Am I unmuted? I'm good. Can you hear me, darling?
I can hear you. Hi.
Oh, I love you so much. Can I just tell you how grateful I am to have you in my life? This work that we've been doing together for now 3 years has just filled me with such joy. And during this very, very, very difficult time in the world for so many of us, this difficult time for me, to get to be in dialogue with you around these important issues, to get smarter, just knowing you. You make me look so good. I'm just so grateful. I'm so grateful. Yeah, that was so beautiful. There was something, there's so many things that you said, but I think it's one of the things you talked about around the grad student and not having and hoping that your answer was sufficient and empowered him. And it reminded me of something that Brene Brown has been saying. I'm a Brene Brown scholar. And she's been saying, particularly in this particular moment, that I'm not here to be right, I'm here to get it right, right? So there's the vulnerability in acknowledging where we might have blind spots is so critical in an accountability, and it's so critical in us getting better. And it's very, very difficult to be in that place because I'm constantly asking myself, what more can I be doing? Am I in my life walking the talk? And I love the way that you talked about how challenging and difficult that is and how uncomfortable that is. And I think it necessarily means that we have to be uncomfortable in our work as artists, as filmmakers, as folks who want to really create change in the world.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. That means the world to me. And you know how brilliant I think you are. Thank you. That makes me think a lot about the way in the conversations you and I were having in making Disclosure about accountability, right? And wanting to hold people accountable, but without demonizing them, right? And how important that was, that, it's not just about getting second chances. It's just about how do we get rid of this fear in our culture of being wrong, right? And often apologizing means we're admitting we're wrong. And there's such a fear around that. And I think that's something, you and I have opinions, and, we believe certain things should be a certain way, and, maybe privately we'll, be a little more critical, but, I think it was really important to us to have that nuance in the film. And there's a lot of cultural tourism, right, that we see in the landscape of transmedia. And we hear people justifying that for one reason or another, because there's this fear of being wrong, fear that and even before a canceled culture, right, there's just this fear of being ostracized and not being given another chance, or being left out of opportunity. And so I kind of just want to talk about how that relates to the landscape of transmedia, and what have you seen maybe recently or in the past, and how, the cultural tourism and transmedia are in relation.
I think the piece, I think honestly, when we think about what it means to pay people for their work, I think that is really crucial. I've been really blessed on, I did a documentary called Free Cece about Cece McDonald, a Black trans woman who ended up in prison for defending herself, and Jack Garris, who directed that. Jack was committed to making sure that like everyone who spoke on camera, that we paid them something. And budget for Free Cece was even smaller than Disclosures. And we found a way to do that. We found a way to compensate Cece. Cece was this Black trans woman who was struggling before she was incarcerated. And then she gets out of prison, and we're making this movie about her. We actually delayed the official release of Free Cece for a year so that we could give Cece an opportunity to go to schools and talk about the film and make money for herself as the protagonist of our film. And that, and I'm hearing stories from trans folks, right? A dear friend of mine recently did a project, and there were a lot of folks on that project who did not get paid, trans folks, and they went specifically into the ballroom community, a community that's been exploited so many times in the culture over the years. We allude to that a little bit in Disclosure with the film Paris is Burning. So and it's funny, I won't name names, but what was interesting for me hearing the behind the scenes is that this multinational company said that they didn't have money to pay all these folks for this shoot that they were doing. And then there was a trans person who I'm so proud of, who was sort of more high profile, involved in the project, who found out that there were trans people there who weren't getting paid, who flew themselves in to do this project on their own dime. And she said, I'm not going to set unless everybody here is getting paid. And she was able to sort of flex that muscle. And then all of a sudden, this company found money to pay people. No, but this is the thing. And I think the piece of making space so that other people, can walk through a door, that when we open the door, we don't shut it behind us, that there's certainly been moments when I've stood up for myself and stood up for projects that I've been involved in, right? Many times when I've had to do that. But I'm so inspired seeing so many young trans folks assert themselves and their power in ways that I never would have had courage to do, because I didn't want to seem difficult. I didn't want to seem it feels, honestly, everything feels worth it. Every sort of thing I've swallowed to hear a story of some of my young siblings, trans siblings, standing up for themselves. And I think that is really, really important. And so the accountability piece around paying people is really, really, really important. And I think we can't talk enough about that, especially with documentaries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it feels like, I don't know if another chapter or a bookend of the idea of non-trans people having, success based on trans stories, right? On both sides of the camera.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we allude to it in, it's funny, we're coming out of Emmys and Emmy season, and I was blessed to get my 4th acting Emmy nomination this year, which seems incredible. Didn't take home the statue, but luckily I have the statue for producing.
And your presentation was really great.
We don't take the statue home. It's so much better when you can look at one in your living room. So that's the T word. But it's something that our very first conversation together, when we sat here in a restaurant in LA, and we talked about how so many non-trans folks have like been nominated for Oscars, for Emmys, Golden Globes for playing trans folks. And between the two of us, we can name 3 openly trans people who we know of who've been nominated. No trans person has ever apparently won an Academy Award, openly trans person that we know of. But there are only 3 in the however many years of the Oscars. Now there's 2 openly transgender acting Emmy nominees, primetime Emmy nominees, 2 in daytime Emmy nominees. So so on less than one hand we can count. So it's really I don't know. It's just I remember I remember years ago there was a director, a non-trans person was playing a role in a film that ended up winning an Academy Award. You can probably find out who. And the director, when asked, "Why didn't you consider hiring a trans person to play this part?" And the director said that there were no trans actors. And I read this, and I was just like, "Why?" And what I'm so excited about with this moment, I'm calling it post-pose, and I've talked about this publicly before, is I know that people can't say that anymore. There's so many of us that people can't say that we don't exist anymore. Trans folks have been acting for a very long time. We document that in Disclosure. And so it's just, it's painful to look at our history, but it's also, exciting to know that in this moment right now, we can make change. In this moment right now, we have an opportunity as artists to create a world anew in front of and behind the camera. And the time to do that is right now, not only for trans people, but for people with disabilities, for people of color, for people of all gender identities. So it's a really, really exciting time. And I think having an understanding of the past is crucial. But for me right now, it's like, how do I, as an artist, move into a new space as an artist and tell different stories and open more doors, but how do I do that in a way that is fully healthy for me? I think self-care is something I've been really focusing on. But then how do we can't, I've been listening to Dr. Joe Dispenza, we can't, he talks a lot about, we can't change our neurochemistry. We can't change ourselves using the same program that we've always used, right? We can't actually change the molecules in our body with using the same mentality, using the same personality, using the same energy fields. We actually have to tap into a new quantum space. We have to tap into a new way of being energetically that can override the programming that we have, right, as human beings. And so right now, in this moment, we have an opportunity culturally to make ourselves over, to create a new personality collectively, energetically, so that we can tap into a new way of being. And I think that is what this moment is calling for. This 2020 that is such a mess on so many levels, I think is telling us that it is time to let go of the old programming. It's time to let go of the old ways of doing things because it's not working. It is not working, but what an opportunity to create something new. And it has to start individually. There's the collective piece, obviously, hopefully people will vote. And then people, as artists, we can imagine changing our organizations, changing, academy memberships and how our productions are run and all these things. But it has to start with us as individuals. How do I make myself over so that I can open up this new space of creation for myself as an artist and as a human being? And it has to start with individuals, but then the opportunity that we have in the world, right? Are you feeling that? Am I crazy? Well, I know I'm crazy.
We all are. And
crazy. Art is crazy.
I absolutely relate to that. And I am thinking just about how we bring that to, specifically to documentary filmmakers. And you've now produced 3 documentaries, right? So from going from one to the other, what do you think going forward? And I think you'll still do documentaries. How do you think there are ways in which we make the films that we can continue to heal ourselves?
Oh, it's really about the healing. It really is. I'm so glad you said that, because for me as an artist, that is consistent through my life. The art has been the space of healing. I think for me, it's always been about listening. On Disclosure, we paid everybody. On Free CC, we paid everybody. For MTV, they said no when we did the T word for MTV. And I remember when we got, it was in 2014, and we got to light the Empire State Building purple for Spirit Day, and most of the kids from the T word were flown to New York at the expense of MTV, and I just brought them all together, and I just gave them some money out of my pocket. I was just like, here, I just remember just wanting to, even though MTV didn't want to pay them, I just was like, here's some money, just not any, but just wanting. So I think for me going forward, what this film is inspired for me as I go into, producing hopefully more scripted projects as well, is thinking about how we can really begin to incorporate some of the production model from Disclosure into productions that I'm involved that are scripted. When we are, affiliated with networks and we're out pitching things now, I'm thinking about what that's going to look like and how we bring in some sort of fellowship program so we can cultivate young talent that is diverse, that is trans, that is non-binary, but people of color, and just so that we have, what does that begin to look like, and then how do we budget that? So I'm thinking about that, and I think it gets trickier when you have networks and production companies who allegedly don't ever, there's no money for things, right? There's always never any, for things. So these are kinds of things I'm thinking about. How do we, because if we want diverse stories, we have to cultivate diverse storytellers who have the skill sets to tell their own stories and tell different stories. So it is a question, and it's something that I talk with my team about all the time as we sort of move forward, and it's a work in progress. So
I love that you're thinking about bringing the fellowship program, right? And that's showing how, the impact of Disclosure is, we're starting to see that. I'm wondering if you could reflect on other ways that we've witnessed the impact already. I mean, of course, we want the film to be seen. We think the more visibility, the more conversations that people are having around trans lives on and off the screen, will lead hopefully towards more equality. But, and obviously, I'm going to revisit that. But what are some ways that you've seen the impact already? What's some of the feedback you've heard?
What's been beautiful about my colleagues, my fellow actors who have watched and just were blown away about what they didn't know that they didn't know. Ryan Reynolds said in an Instagram story that this film will change how he sees film and how he'll make films going forward. That's one of my favorites, because I was like, this is really, what more can we ask for, And
he's he started a fellowship, right? Didn't he start a fellowship program just this summer?
I wasn't aware of that. If that is true, that is absolutely amazing. And Ryan is one of the few sort of A-list cis straight white men who've commented publicly, that I'm aware of anyway, who've commented publicly on our film. But then I think when things like what Nat said at the beginning, it just touched me so much, and I received that Nat, and for me, that's why we made this. We sat and had conversations about this for years, about who our audience is, and it's trans folks. But it's been so beautiful seeing folks in the industry not just rethink how they have come to understand trans people, but how they've come to understand everyone, right? And what the impact of film is in terms of creating narratives. And then I think we can think differently about gender in general, even beyond just trans identities. And so that has been so exciting, seeing people have all of these kind of aha moments, watching the film and expressing that publicly, and seeing people shift and change. And I can't wait to see what kind of work comes out in what I'm calling a post-disclosure world. And honestly, I tell you, I was in a meeting about a film that we're developing, and we were talking about a plot line, and I said, I don't know if this plot line will work in a post-disclosure world. And it's something that I've been working on Disclosure for years, but now after it was out in the world, I was like, oh, I don't know, maybe we need to rethink this story point. And so that's exciting, right? That we get to, because when we know better, we do better, and we get to make different decisions as artists because we have this vital information. Yeah. And that's pretty dope.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also really excited about the other areas that we're trying to get the film into, to have, an impact, like the judicial system, and having, hearing that a lawyer at the ACLU watched a non-trans lawyer, right? Chase told me this, that a non-trans lawyer watched Disclosure before they were preparing to defend a trans client. There's a California group of judges that use Disclosure to educate themselves. I mean, that's really exciting to me. Workplace diversity and inclusion. We had, HR groups have been contacting us to talk about Disclosure and also the way we made it. I'm super excited about that as well. And I think we do have to go to a Q&A, but say your last thing and then we'll open it up to the.
No, I think that is the piece. What does it mean? The work is so important, but then ideally, what does it mean for the material conditions of people to change? And in the world that, like, we want to make, stories that are compelling, but then how do we change people's lives in the real world? And that's really what it's all about. So, yay, amazing to hear that. Okay, questions.
Okay, I think Nat, there we go. That's for you. Take it.
Hi, Laverne, love you so much. I'm trans, but have been told the film could be triggering, for lack of a better term, for trans individuals. Would you agree with that sentiment? I would love to watch. I mean, it has been for some trans folks, and we talked about trigger warnings and whatnot. I think it can be, but I think what Nat said, and everyone's going to have a different experience, but what Nat said at the beginning, I think, is that it can be disturbing, angering, absolutely. But for me, it is so empowering to see how to have the trans lens, to see how much humor that trans people can have around some of these representations, how coming to voice around it, just having that, even though something can be painful, getting to speak about it, getting to speak that pain and that trauma, becomes healing. And so I think, yes, it can be potentially triggering, but I think giving voice to the pain, giving voice to the trauma is part of the healing. And so that is my hope. I mean, I believe, that is possible. And I know I've talked to enough trans people who've seen the film who, there were difficult moments in the film for them, but ultimately they felt empowered because I think a lot of trans folks saw themselves on that screen and saw themselves reflected in our protagonists, in our cast, telling their own stories. So that's my take on it. So I wouldn't say, you can watch the film and not be triggered. I don't know. Everyone has a different experience with the work, but I hope that's helpful. And I'd love for you to see the film, of course.
I want to just add one thing to that. I mean, we certainly never imagined people watching this film in isolation, right? It was definitely something we imagined would happen in community. And I think part of hearing other people have the similar experience in person next to you is, part of what makes it less triggering, right? Which is part of lets you feel less alone. So if you're feeling like you may be triggered, maybe watch it, with someone that you're FaceTiming, so that you can, reflect and process it in real time. I think what happens, like what Nat was talking about, that it's, while it was painful, there was something really healing about seeing the feelings you felt in isolation for so long, seeing that reflected. That's kind of what kept it not being triggering for them. But I think it's really an important history, and I think there's something really beautiful to see people reflecting the pain you have felt or the feelings you have felt. But don't do it alone if you're concerned. Like, have a watch party.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Ma'am.
Ma'am, what are your mentees doing now? How did the fellowship contribute to their career and job opportunities? Yes, I'm after some good news. So yesterday we had a breakout session hosted by Queer Doc, where we had we had one of our fellows on there speaking, and we also had our DP, Ava, and our fellow Nava was there, who, gosh, Nava is a force. She's already put out two films, I think, since being on our set, and now she's starring, or not, I don't know those technical words, but a regular guest star, is that what it's called? On
Maybe
on I think it's an HBO show. I'm so sorry, Nava, if I'm getting this wrong. But so that's certainly some good news. She's doing miraculously. Emery, also one of our fellows, he's showing a film now at I know for sure at Frameline, and I think they just posted about another film. I mean, so our fellows are showing their work across the country. Some of our fellows have gotten jobs. We had a legal fellow who now works at Netflix because of his, from working on our film. Gosh, and I'm going through my brain of our fellows who I don't know, I'm so proud of them. I feel really tenderly about our fellows. If any of you are watching, chime in and give us updates, because I'm drawing a blank right now. But those are a few.
Amazing. Laverne, I had the great pleasure of working with you way back when Out of the Center was still being broadcast. How did that unpaid position as host of that show play a role in your career? Aw. So, how did the show, the monthly show that the LGBT Center of New York City did every month to let you know what was happening at the center, and it was sort of on cable access. I think you can actually watch old episodes on YouTube. What me hosting? God, some of them are embarrassing. But what was fun for me is I got to read a teleprompter, and I got to kind of I got to get this experience. And what I was back, and when a lot of young people who want to work in this business ask me, how do I break in? And I say, you just do everything you can. For me, for years I did things for free. And, we talked about how important it is to pay people, but for years I did student films for free. I did off-Broadway theater for free. And I am hosting Out at the Center for many years is another thing I did for free that I feel has really, when I have to read a teleprompter at an award show, or I've hosted things before, I feel like all of those many, many hours have prepared me. And so I think you have to just do it. You have to find a way to do it. And that 10,000 hours thing, I believe, is real. I know in my spirit that like when you work really, really hard at something and just find a way to do it, that you'll get better at it. And so, yeah. Out at the Center was awesome. And I learned a lot too about what was going on in our community. I remember seeing one of the things, I give long answers. I remember seeing footage from the first Gay Liberation March in 1970 that we showed on Out at the Center. And I remember being so inspired by that footage. So I learned a lot too, hosting that show.
I love that. I actually worked at Manhattan Neighborhood Network, which was the public access television station. So I remember seeing that show.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Any other questions?
How did you acquire your archival footage and movie clips for the film? Good one.
It was years of research, years and years and years. I mean, when I started the film, the first step of research was interviewing trans people that I knew who had worked on one side of the camera or the other, which is it's just what we see in the film, but this was done, mostly I think I had one or two people helping me at a time, but there were times I was by myself, with the camera, with the audio, doing the interview, setting up the lights. And I traveled across the country doing that for about 6 to 8 months. And that's how I built the database to begin with, right? That was the primary resource. And then, as we were getting the clips, it was everywhere from, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to, well, what was the exact question? Can you put it up there again? I feel like I went to it.
How did you find the
How did I find them? Oh gosh. Everything from, online to my friend Nick Adams had a storage unit with about, 8 boxes full of VHS tapes, some beta and DVDs, that he had been collecting and recording off the television for a long time. And there were a few other places like that where I got people's personal materials. I found, part of the archival research that I did was trying to find where trans people had written about seeing films and TV. And there's this magazine that was started by Lou Sullivan called F2M International, or F2M Magazine, I think it was one of those. And in there are trans people writing reviews on trans films, right? And so then I would kind of get led to more information and then figure out where that person was. And sometimes I would get in touch with that person. And so, and I went to libraries and museums and different archives all over to find the material. And we were able to use it all for fair use.
Amazing. Are there foundations or initiatives that have been particularly supportive of trans filmmakers? What does that support look like beyond grants? That's a great question, Sam.
I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if kind of going through my head if any of our funders are particularly focused on trans work. I can't think right now of any fund that we received that was particularly focused on trans work. I'm sure they exist. But I don't know.
That's a really good question. Do they exist though? I mean, we're assuming they exist, but do they?
I think they
there-
probably exist in like $500, $1,000, to get you started kind of funding. Or maybe for other, maybe not for film. Film is so expensive. How big of a role did the impact of the film and the ethos of the team play in negotiations with Netflix? Why don't you take that, Laverne? It's an interesting question.
It's always hard to say. I don't know. I think when negotiations are so tricky. We had approached Netflix, of course, and we pitched this a lot of places and heard no's. It's really deep how hard it is to sell a trans film still, how we're considered niche still. And we had some kind of interest from Netflix. And then I think 5 weeks before we premiered, we found out that they were interested in premiering us during June because it was Pride, and they wanted to make us an original documentary, and we were sort of over the moon. And I really don't know. I'm not really clear about how our production model influenced that. I don't know. I'm not sure if it did. Do you know?
The one thing I could think about is there were trans people that we had worked with who are now working at Netflix. And so there were conversations that were happening months, if not years, before we started the negotiations. And I think, because of that might have, I don't know, endeared people in a different way. But I don't know. Business, when it comes to selling, it's a business. And I'm not sure that, I don't know, I'll leave it there.
How can we take this production model in non-US contexts where it's hard to find non-trans women on film sets and resources are non-existing? How can we translate this model to diverse geographies? That's a great question.
I see.
Well, I think so there's fewer. I think the insinuation or the suggestion is that there's fewer in other places around the world. There's fewer trans folks working in front of and behind the camera. So then, I think again, it's about how does one cultivate the talent? How does one cultivate? Reach out to communities to create skill sets, not only working in front of the camera but behind the camera. And I think I've been thinking a lot about that and what that constitutes and how the levels of privilege that I really got to enjoy just because I've been in the arts my whole life, that my mother consented to allowing me to study dance when I was in 3rd grade. And then there was this amazing arts program called Culture in Black and White for low-income kids in my hometown of Mobile, Alabama, where I got to go and train, right? So how that amazing community program was the beginning of my dance training, and that dance training took me to the Alabama School of Fine Arts, and the Alabama School of Fine Arts changed my life. And so that even though I was poor and working class and on scholarship everywhere, that the education was an incredible privilege. And so that 10,000 hours that I alluded to earlier was so critical and pivotal. So I think that these are the things that we have to begin to cultivate at every level, training for actors to work in front of the camera and behind the camera, and that training that's good and affordable. And then the exposure too is so important. I want to shout out Black Women in Opera. It's an Instagram page, and they're doing their first festival this tomorrow. And there's a real interest in the Black community, cultivating this love for opera. And I love opera, and arts education was such a huge thing for me as a kid, and going to an art school, and that changed my life. And so I think that the different kinds of exposure that folks know that they can work in film and television, not just in front of the camera, so that how do we give, I think it's a bigger conversation around arts education, honestly, that starts younger, and then exposure. And so, yeah. and that's global.
These are such great questions. Thank you for joining me here, Laverne. And miss seeing you in person.
I know. I don't see people in person often. I've been very, very isolated. So it's lovely to spend time with you, Sam. It's lovely to feel the energy of fellow artists and filmmakers who are grappling with so many important issues of our times in their work. And I hope that we've said something today that can inspire you in what you're doing as artists, how you make your films. Yeah, I hope we've said something that is helpful for you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Sam and Laverne. I'm swimming in all the gems that you dropped today. So we have a couple more panels coming up later today. Check out the schedule. Thanks. See you again soon.